Hello, Namaskar. In this video, we are going to be discussing this chapter called the interview, which is essentially a two-part kind of a chapter, a slightly different kind of a chapter, but nevertheless very interesting and of specific relevance to me because it talks about the interview. Okay. What exactly is an interview? Interview is a structured conversation in which one person asks the questions to seek answers and the other person provides the answers. Pretty much simple and straight. Now, if you see the introduction, it is written by Christopher Sylvester. He was a student of history, and following is an excerpt taken from his introduction to the Penguin Book of Interviews, an anthology from 1859 to the present day. So it talks about the reactions to interviews, why certain people do not like being interviewed, especially celebrities. And the second part is an actual interview done by Mukund Padmanabhan, who was earlier the editor of the Hindu newspaper, with a writer called Umberto Eco. Now, in the Penguin Book of Interviews, Christopher Sylvester writes that the interview format is 130 years old. Okay. And it is pretty much a staple form of journalism, right? Journalism is incomplete without an interview, right? If you did not have interviews, how would you really get information from people who matter? Okay. Some may see the interview as a format where the truth is revealed. Others may see it as an art form. So let's get started with this particular chapter. Since its invention a little over 130 years ago, the interview format is that old. The interview has become a commonplace of journalism. Today, almost everybody who is literate will have read an interview at some point of time or the other. Several thousand celebrities have been interviewed over the years, obviously, some of them repeatedly. So it's hardly surprising that opinions of the interview, of its functions, methods, and merits. Functions, what is the purpose of the interview? The method of taking the interview and the merit of the interview itself vary considerably. Some are very good, some are not very good, some are necessary, some are absolutely ridiculous. Some might make quite extravagant claims for it as being in its highest form a source of truth and in its practice an art. Now, some people may think that this is the source of truth. This interview reveals the truth. Some people, the way it is done, the way it is conducted, it may seem almost like an art form wherein you kind of delve. For instance, there are some interviews where you do not ask the most obvious questions. Let me give you an example. Okay, an interview which I had done with Amir Khan. This was before Gajni. Now, any film journalist would generally ask questions like, "Aapko film mein kaam karke kaisa laga? A.R. Murugadas ke saath kaam karke kaisa laga?" Ye, is tarah ka almost double role ki tarah. Double role nahi tha, but very different kind of two characters. How did you? All that kind of thing. I dealt that interview in a slightly different way. I kind of went into Amir Khan's preparation for the role. Given the fact that Amir Khan is known to be a perfectionist, so how is it for someone like Amir Khan to play a person who has kind of lost his memory, who does not remember everything, short-term memory loss? So how did he kind of prep himself for a role like that? How was his thinking process? What was the process that he put in place, say 2 months, 3 months before he actually started shooting in order to become that particular man, right? And whether he shot one part completely differently, then went into a totally different zone for the second part. Okay, obviously, since the look was different, I would have assumed that it would be so. But even sometimes what happens is that there are overlapping. There is not much of a gap. You finished in January, you start from February. No, but you would give it a gap. So what was the entire process like? His thinking, why did he choose a role like that? Whether it was just because the Tamil version in featuring Surya was a success, or was it some other reason? So what I mean to say is that when you kind of conduct an interview like that, when you bring out the thinking part of that person, of the celebrity, it makes for more absorbing, because you are the audience is able to see the person, the mind behind the actor, instead of giving mindless answers like, both maza aaya, we shot for 40 days, we had a great time and all that kind of thing. Inane answers which kind of leave you with nothing to cherish after the interview has been seen and heard. So that way it becomes some kind of an art form, and at least an effort is made towards that. Others, usually celebrities who see themselves as the victims, might despise the interview as an unwarranted intrusion. Unwarranted means something which they do not want. They do not want to be interviewed, and they see this as an intrusion into their life, into their space. And to feel it somehow diminishes them. That, it kind of, you're put in front of a camera or you are interviewed, you kind of, become an object who is being questioned. So they do not find it very comfortable in that sense. Just as in some primitive cultures, it is believed that if one takes a photographic portrait of somebody, then one is stealing that person's soul. There are some religions which do not permit, or they do not particularly like someone's photographs being taken. Okay, so it is not considered very positive. V.S. Naipaul feels that some people are wounded by interviews and lose a part of themselves. Now, that's an extreme view. Okay, he believes that because their life gets exposed, so they kind of, lose a part of themselves. That aura about that person is no longer there. Because if I know everything about that person through that interview, then that sense of mystique is lost. That sense of aura, that sense of suspense. Oh, acha, is this the way he chooses his roles? Oh, I thought it must be something very deep. So once that myth around that star, around the celebrity is broken, then people no longer feel enamored of the intellectual part of that particular celebrity. In this case, a writer like V.S. Naipaul. Lewis Carroll, the creator of Alice in Wonderland, was said to have had a just horror of the interviewer. He was terrified of the interviewer, and he never consented to be interviewed. He never allowed anyone to interview him. It was his horror of being lionized which made him thus repel would-be acquaintances, interviewers, and the persistent petitioners for his autograph, and he would otherwise read the stories of his success in silencing all such people with much satisfaction and amusement. That, people who wanted to interview him, people who wanted to take his autograph, people who were his acquaintances, that is, who vaguely knew him, he kind of kept everyone at bay. And later on, he would boast about how successfully he managed to do that in some gatherings, right? So he obviously took a lot of pride in the fact that he was able to keep all people who wanted to interview him or to get intimate with him at bay, at arm's length. Then we talk about Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling expressed an even more condemnatory attitude towards the interviewer. His wife Caroline writes in her diary for 14 October 1892 that their day was wrecked by two reporters from Boston who must have maybe trespassed into their area, and they did not obviously liked it, the Kiplings. She reports her husband as saying to the reporters, "Why do I refuse to be interviewed? Because it is immoral. It is a crime, just as much of a crime as an offense against my person." He calls it an assault, and just as much merits punishment. So he obviously has a very sharp attitude towards being interviewed. It is cowardly and vile. So you need to know all these keywords of what Rudyard Kipling said about interviewers. No respectable man would ask it, much less give it. So it is not respectable to ask for an interview. It is also not respectable to give and grant an interview. Yet Kipling had himself perpetrated such an assault on Mark Twain. Now that is hypocritical. It was hypocritical for Rudyard Kipling to actually say it, because he had actually in 1894, 2 years later, Mark Twain, he had actually not Mark Twain, H.G. Wells is 1894. Sorry, I misread a couple of sentences. Rudyard Kipling had himself interviewed Mark Twain a few years ago. So for him to say that was absolutely double standards. H.G. Wells, in an interview in 1894, referred to the interviewing ordeal. Okay, H.G. Wells, all this author's thing is put down here. Okay. H.G. Wells is number 3, an English novelist, journalist, sociologist, and historian, known for his books like The Time Machine and The Invisible Man. So H.G. Wells said that he called it an ordeal. He called it cowardly and vile. Kipling. H.G. Wells called it the interviewing ordeal, but was a fairly frequent interview, and 40 years later found himself interviewing Joseph Stalin of Russia. Saul Bellow, who has consented to be interviewed on several occasions, nevertheless once described interviews as being like thumbprints on his windpipe. Okay, now thumbprints on his windpipe is basically means that it was akin to choking or suffocating someone by applying pressure on the throat. So you can imagine what he thought of it. He thought of interviews as something which, as though someone was trying to strangulate the person. And obviously he felt discomfort and pressure while giving an interview. Yet despite the drawbacks of the interview, it's a supremely serviceable medium. That's what the author says of communication. These days, more than at any other time, our most vivid impressions of our contemporaries are through the interviews. Dennis Bryan has written almost everything of moment reaches us through one man asking questions of another. Because of this, the interviewer holds a position of unprecedented power and influence. So that was as far as part 1 was concerned. Now let's move to part 2 of Mukund Padmanabhan's interview with Umberto Eco. Okay, it's a slightly strange kind of name. Umberto Eco. This is an extract from an interview of Umberto Eco with Mukund Padmanabhan of The Hindu. He was editor of The Hindu. Eco was a professor at the University of Bologna in Italy and had already acquired a formidable reputation as a scholar for his ideas on semiotics, the study of signs. Now, the study, semiotics is a systematic study of the sign processes and making meaning of those signs. It involves signs as a communication tool to convey feelings or thoughts through any of the 5 senses: sight, sound, touch, feel, etc. Now, literary fiction, he was a very prolific writer, okay, and his most famous one was The Name of the Rose, which sold more than 10 million copies. Okay, actually, I googled it and I found that it has sold over 50 million copies. So obviously, this particular work is dated, obviously, and it is one of the bestsellers, won many awards. Now, semiotics is the medieval aesthetics is a philosophy of beauty during the medieval period. That's also something which we will read. So Mukund says, the English novelist and academic. Now, this is the style of the interview. It's a conversation. You can't even call it an interview. It's a conversation that Mukund is having with Umberto Eco. The English novelist and academic David Lodge once remarked, I can't understand how one man can do all the things he does. Eco says, maybe I give the impression of doing many things. Now, you see, interview is usually associated with what? With asking questions. But here you see the opening one, he's just kind of making an observation. He's talking about what someone has said about Umberto Eco. So he's kind of making him comfortable. It's a friendly kind of a chat. Maybe I give the impression of doing many things, but in the end, I'm convinced I'm always doing the same thing, which is, now you see, he just kind of, okay, kyun? Aisa? It's like a short, it's not even a long question. Now that's more difficult to explain. I have some philosophical interests and I pursue them through my academic work and my novels. Even my books for children are about non-violence and peace. You see the same bunch of ethical, philosophical interests. And then I have a secret. Did you know what will happen? Now, this is an interesting thought. Umberto Eco says that if you eliminate all the empty spaces from the universe, like for instance, there is a space between me and the machine, right? If you eliminate this empty space and similarly eliminate all the empty space in the universe will become as big as my fist. That's what he says. Okay, you eliminate all the empty spaces in all the atoms. So he says, similarly, we have a lot of empty spaces in our lives. I call them interstices. Say you are coming over to my place. You are in an elevator, and while you are coming up, I'm waiting for you. That's an empty space. I'm not doing anything at that point in time. This is an interstice, an empty space. I work in those empty spaces. So while waiting for your elevator to come up to my floor, from the first to the third floor, I would have already written an article. So he believes in making use of all the empty spaces. Not everyone can do that, of course. Your non-fictional writing, your scholarly work has a certain playful and personal quality about it. So, you normally associate research pieces with being very dry and drab, right? Colorless kind of stuff. But it is a marked departure from a regular academic style, which is invariably depersonalized and often dry and boring, right? PhD theses are generally very boringly written. Have you consciously adopted? I mean, is it something which you have done deliberately? You have worked on making them interesting like that, and so that they are not depersonalized and dry and boring, or does it come naturally to you? So Eco says, well, and now Eco is replying with giving an anecdote. He's replying by giving an example of what has happened to him. So he's making it even more interesting conversation. He says, when I presented my first doctoral dissertation, that is his thesis in Italy, one of the professors says scholars learn a lot of a certain subject. Then they make a lot of false hypotheses, that is false thesis. Then they correct them. And at the end, they put the conclusions. You, on the contrary, what you have done is that you have told the story of your research, even including your trials and errors. जितनी भी गलतियां की उन सब के बारे में भी तुमने लिखा है. So you have told the story. You are more of a storyteller. You have not just made it about, findings and data and research points and stuff like that. At the same time, he recognized I was right and went on to publish my dissertation as a book, which meant he appreciated it. At that point, at the age of 22, I understood scholarly books should be written the way I had done, by telling the story of the research. Always tell a story, which is why, for instance, when we used to go to, let's say, report on, say, the state of education in, let's say, a particular state. Now, if you start a story by saying that, there is a deficit of X amount of money, in this district of this state, it has not got the funds which are allocated to it under the category of education, which is why this school does not even have chalk and duster for its classrooms. If you start like that, the chances are that the audience may get bored. So what do? So you start a story with an example. You start a story saying, this school in this village, in this district of this state, and fill in the blanks. Okay. I mean, you cannot say this state and this thing. There are 40 children, but they have to make do without any chalk. So he kind of, either we say that the teacher has spent money from his own pocket in order to buy the chalk, or to buy the books for the children because they don't have any access to notebooks, right? So you give an example, start with a case study, what we call a case study, in order to personalize the problem, in order to make it, listen to this, relatable for the audience, so that the audience can relate. Okay, this is what is happening in this school, in this village, in this state, right? So you are able to relate it, personalize it, humanize the problem, instead of making it about data points and statistics. So what he says is that they should always have a narrative aspect. And that is why I started writing narratives, that is novels, so late, at the age of 50 or so. I remember that my dear friend Ronald Barthes always was frustrated that he was an essayist and not a novelist, because essays are different from writing novels. Novel is a story. Essay is not a story, more or less. He wanted to do creative writing one day or another, but he died before he could do so. I never felt this kind of frustration. I started writing novels by accident. I had nothing to do one day, and so I started. Novels probably satisfied my taste for narration. Mukund, talking about novels. Now you see, Mukund is doing something very interesting. He's taking from what he has said and continuing the conversation. He is not someone who has come with a set of 10 questions कि तुम जो भी बोलो मेरा next question, okay, मेरा पांचवा question हो गया, मैं छठे question पे जाता हूं. Not like that. He's listening. A very important trait for someone who is interviewing is to listen, and you continue from what the person has said in the last answer, and you kind of make it into an engaging conversation. And that's when the audience would be interested in listening or reading the interview. Talking about novels, from being a famous academic, you went on to become spectacularly famous after the publication of The Name of the Rose. You have written 5 novels against many more scholarly works of non-fiction, at least more than 20 of them. Well, he says over 40. Now, Mukund has done his homework, but even then he's not accurate. He says over 20, he says actually over 40. Over 40? So that's news to him. Among them, so Mukund should have ideally done it. He would have done, which is why he knows 20, but even then he's not accurate. His information is not completely up to date. Among them, a seminal piece of work on semiotics, but ask most people about Umberto Eco and they will say, oh, he's the novelist. Does that bother you? Yes, because I consider myself a university professor who writes novels only on Sundays. It's not a joke. I participate in academic conferences. So he's a part-time novelist who writes only on Sundays and not meetings of pen clubs and writers. I identify myself with the academic community. So he says, I consider myself more as an academician instead of someone who is in the creative writing field. But okay, if they, I know that by writing novels, I reach a larger audience. I cannot expect to have 1 million readers with stuff on semiotics. So if you write something on semiotics, which is an extremely sophisticated and a very what's a technical subject, he's not going to get 1 million readers, right? But with his novels, he manages to do that. Which brings me to my next question. The Name of the Rose is a very serious novel, right? So he's kind of linking it up like that. It's a detective yarn, so there is a sense of suspense, but it also delves into metaphysics, theology, and medieval history. I told you about medieval history, what it is. Medieval aesthetics is the name of the philosophy, sorry. Medieval history of the medieval period. And yet it enjoyed a huge mass audience. Were you puzzled at all by this? No, journalists are puzzled, and sometimes publishers. And this is because journalists and publishers believe that people like trash and don't like difficult reading experiences. He says that if you give them good stuff, if you give them interesting stuff, people will read it. It's not as though people like to read only trash. Consider there are 6 billion people on this planet. The Name of the Rose sold between 10 and 15 million copies. So in a way, I reached, actually 50, but we'll have to go by what it's saying right now. So in a way, I reached only a small percentage of readers. But it is exactly these kind of readers who do not want easy experiences. They want to read interesting, engaging, and perhaps more sophisticated kind of content, or at least don't always want this. Mahesh Bhatt had once said that people like these kind of movies, which is why these kind of movies are being made, which is totally wrong. If you give them something more interesting, the discerning audience will always lap it up. Just like it's on YouTube, you give them crap, people think crap dalne se sab log dekhte hain. No, but if you give them better quality stuff, there will always be takers for something which is of a superior quality, or at least don't always want this. I myself at 9 p.m. after dinner watch television and want to enjoy it, either Miami Vice or Emergency Room. I enjoy it and I need it, but not all day. Okay. Could the huge success of the novel have anything to do with the fact that it dealt with a period of medieval history? That's possible. So he's kind of conversing and he's kind of cutting it. But let me tell you another story, because I often tell stories like a Chinese wise man. So he compares himself with a Chinese wise man. My American publisher said, while she loved my book, she did not expect to sell more than 3,000 copies in a country where nobody has seen a cathedral or studies Latin. So I was given an advance for 3,000 copies. Okay. But in the end, it sold 2 or 3 million in the US. A lot of books. So it says that it shows that there is an appetite for such books. A lot of books have been written about the medieval past far before mine. I think the success of the book is a mystery. Even I don't know. Nobody can predict it. I think if I had written The Name of the Rose 10 years earlier or 10 years later, it wouldn't have been the same. Why it worked at that time is a mystery. Even I don't know. But it worked, which means that people like to read certain kind of stuff, and I provided it at just the right time. So more than the content of the interview, you need to see how the interview has been conducted. And that's what my question and answers also deal with, that whether interviews are necessary, in what is the style of the interview between Mukund and Eco, and what do the first part, of course, is there about what different celebrities from Kipling to V.S. Naipaul, etc. feel about the interview. So all those aspects you need to include, prepare for your questions and answers. Okay. So I hope this is clear. Thank you very much for watching.